Hi everyone, this is the first video on this channel titled Approaching Seconds, and this is a complete guide on second speeches. Obviously not exhaustive, but covers a lot of stuff and is quite comprehensive. Just two things to note, given that this is the first video on this channel. Firstly, I'm not home right now, so I don't have most of my setup here. Best believe the future videos are going to be really much better. Secondly, just note that this is a debate channel. It's like lectures a good amount of the time, so like don't expect anything crazy. With that said, onto a few disclaimers. Firstly, this video is going to have a focus on Proposition second speeches.
2, 1, and scammer gets scammed, buddy.
Yes, I know, but a lot of the stuff can still be used in opposition second speeches as well, i.e. you can cross-apply these skills, and there's also going to be a focus on the general stuff on second speeches and also on opposition second speeches. The second disclaimer to note is that this video assumes some understanding of advanced debating skills, such as weighing and strategy. Ultimately, there will be new videos on some of the skills discussed in this video, such as weighing and style, so there will be like much more in-depth stuff on those things. With that said, so this video is covering second speeches, and we all understand second speeches are really hard to do given that you don't have as much time and you're also in the middle of a debate that's still happening. So the first part of this lesson is, why are second speeches really important? And I think there are 4 reasons. The first is that they have the power to influence where the round goes, because after all, you are the first evaluative speaker and are somewhat in the, not somewhat, but you literally are in the middle, right? You've already seen what's happened between the first speakers, and if you're an O2, you've seen like 3 speeches being given. So you can do a lot, right? You can add on to the debate and you can evaluate. And notice that like your type of evaluation is much harder, right? Because in first speeches, you're foreseeing the debate. In third speeches, you've already seen the debate, you can evaluate. But in second speeches, you are evaluating what has already happened, but anticipating what more can happen, which is why it makes it really difficult, but also really important. The second reason that second speeches are important is that there has been a meta change in the current years. Usually, and a lot of other workshops from like really good speakers, very like renowned speakers have mentioned that right now there's a trend where the best speakers are being put in second, or rather at least the second speeches are where the most strategic speakers are. So like just a quick like crash course, usually there's some philosophies that suggested in the past that the best speaker would have to be put in first speech because they are the one translating the case. Whereas other philosophies suggested that the best speaker should be in the third speech because they've already seen the debate, they can just put all the important rebuttals. However, right now, the most strategic speakers and even the best speakers are being put in second. This is because second speeches have broader understandings of the case recently, and they have to deepen their analysis and extend the case. The third reason they're important is, as I've suggested, they are the most strategic role. You have a lot of things to do, which leads me to the last reason, where you have a lot of things to do with little time. But this can be an advantage because if imagine you're in P2 and you literally did so much and you're pressurizing the O2, and then now as the O2, you're like, whoa, there's a lot of things that's happened. How can I rebut to this, or how did this speaker think of all of these? There are a lot of things that go through making a really good P2 and even a really good O2, and this video will cover the following. Cool. Now we're on to the goals of second speeches, and here there are roughly 6 goals that second speeches should try and achieve. The first is you have to defend your case. Insofar as how successful was opposition first or even proposition second in dealing with your first speech. Here you give additional responsive work to the responses that have already been brought onto your case. The second goal is rebuilding the case that your first has already brought forward. And here you can do a couple of things, right? You can rebuild the argument by either deepening the analysis, bridging the gaps, putting more illustrations or examples, or even impacting. And here, a lot of first speeches probably don't weigh, and you should probably already have that conversation with your first speakers. But let's say for some reason your first speech doesn't have any weighing of the importance of the argument, and maybe the other speakers didn't respond to that argument at all. Here you give the weigh up and rebuild the importance of that argument by maybe making the impacts comparative. But just a note, even though you're rebuilding in second speeches, don't make way-ups the core thing of the speech, because that's what third speeches are also for. Another video will be on that too. Here in second speeches, you should obviously be weighing, right? Very important things, because, sometimes some things just make logical sense, or sometimes you're trying to tier the responses because the other argument was really important. But I think that second speeches should focus on direct responses first before doing anything. The third goal of a second speech is to deal with the most pressing issues. Here, especially if you're on prop, a P2 should be dealing with things such as contextual issues, strategy issues, the problems with the model or counterfactual from the O1, or even what the debate is about and how it's won. And here's why second speeches are very important, because they can dictate how these pressing issues can turn out, especially with how you deal with them. The fourth thing that second speeches have to achieve is that they have to adapt to what has happened. And this is important because if you watch other workshops on second speeches or other videos on second speeches, or in BP they call them like deputy speeches, usually when you have to adapt to what has happened and realign, this means that you are in a reactive speech, because sometimes you can't always prep what the other side's going to say. So here you just have to, adapt to what has happened. Fifthly, you have to progress the case, right? And the way you progress the case is much different to thirds, right? Because thirds rely on rebuttal, whereas in your speech, you can put new matter and use extensions. That's why the most strategic speakers sometimes, especially in break rounds, just use their speech as a purely responsive role where they aren't making a new argument. They're just extending the analysis and extending the rebuttal they're saying. Because here you don't rely on rebuttal. You can bring in new matter, because like second speeches still are like early in the debate, so it gives an opportunity for the other side to respond. Thirds can't usually do this. Ultimately, you should inform the judge where you are in the round. And just note, you are meant to anticipate where the debate will go, because obviously after your speech, there will still be other adaptations from the next speeches. But up until the point of your speech, you need to convince the judge why you're winning to that point. And debating, although is a very technical thing, and although we try to say judges should be as objective as possible, biases exist. So if the P1 and P2 gave really, really good speeches, that stays in a judge's mind for quite a long time. So these are roughly the 6 goals of what a second speech should achieve. Under the 5th goal, I mentioned something, which leads me to the other part of this video, right? The competing philosophies that exist, especially with the meta change that is currently existing. So in the past, second speeches used to be classical substantive speeches. So here, usually the first would just put a principle or a necessity argument, and they just set the battleground for the debate. Therefore, the second speech, especially the P2, would start bringing like 5-minute arguments, 4-minute arguments, right? Whereas with the meta change, they're like, oh, this is a heavy responsive role. It's just like a third speech. These are competing philosophies on how second speeches can be crafted. But a lot of the times, people just say which philosophy is better than the other, but they forget something. There's a commonality on each philosophy, and that is role fulfillment, insofar as you're both extending the case. And here, especially in South Africa, I know, for example, I do a third version, whereas I still give an argument, right? But not a purely argumentative second speech, and I don't get credited. And again, obviously the win matters. You shouldn't be caring about speaker scores, but in international levels, you still get credited as long as you're extending the case and not just pure rebuttal, right? You're still giving extensions, you're still evolving your case. As long as you're doing that, you are fulfilling your role as a second speaker. And that's really important. And I watched a workshop from a really, really great second speaker who spoke for Team Canada. And they suggested that Isaac Cape, that's the name, suggested that in round, you still have to somewhat give an argument. But if you notice in the meta change, in break rounds, they're just purely responsive speeches. But you still have to extend your case in some way. So those are roughly the goals and the commonality in these two competing philosophies. Given that we've talked about constructive and substantive, like in second speeches, how then do you have arguments, or what are the general outlines I would suggest go in second speech arguments, especially in P2, right? The first thing to note is that this argument should also be important because this is a different way of winning the debate. Secondly, I would suggest that you need at least 2 minutes for that argument. And this is just a minimum for a complete argument. Always try to aim for 3, but 2 minutes has been like the current meta change. And I've always been told 2 minutes is enough to somewhat have a complete argument. So a bit of context, a bit of strategy, important links and impacting. And obviously, if you try to reach for the 3rd minute, you could, have a comparative or a way up. Generally, these arguments are somewhat speculative, i.e. they're just a benefit that would occur in the future or a harm that would occur in the future, but they don't always have to be. They can also be important. So how then, or what arguments could you make in second speeches? There are roughly 4 types. The first is you argue about a different actor, or if you're arguing on the same actor, you somewhat like go a bit more specific. And here's a quick philosophy lesson where I watched from Hamza's workshop, my debating inspiration. And he suggested there are 2 philosophies that he always uses when it comes down to actors that he learned from philosophy class. There's a concept called decomposition. And pretty much what you're doing there is that you pick a much more specific actor. So for instance, if you're talking about minority groups, they're obviously intersectional, i.e. there is maybe in the Black feminist movement, there's probably someone who's also part of the LGBTQ plus community. And there you focus specifically on that actor. The other form of this philosophy is supercomposition. And there you put the actor in the grand scheme of things, right? So for instance, especially in international relation motions, you may be talking about how you're better for a state. And then now you can show how you're better at more regional or continental trades, for example. So that's one way of thinking of these arguments. The second way is you're probably thinking of a different impact. And usually sometimes this is the absolute worst case scenario where you probably use the same mechanisms, the same analysis that the first speaker used, but to reach a different impact. So for instance, in a debate about maybe parenting models, the first speaker could talk about how this specific family parenting model helps family relationships on happiness. And then your second speaker will talk about how it helps family relationships on trust. These are different impacts that may use the same mechanism. The third way is you argue in a different context. So maybe you're arguing in the first speech in developing nations, and then in the second speech you use the arguments around developed nations. The last way is a way that I usually use in the teams that I've been in, and is a go-to strategy where you use scenario-based arguments, right? Usually even if arguments, and they're important because it anticipates that the O1 may have a really good argument that counter-rebuts your argument or deals with your argument really, really well. A good example is in success and failure motions, right? In the first speech, you could argue how you're more likely to reach success, but then O1 may give really good responses, have a really good argument as to why you're more likely to fail. Then in your second speech, you're like, even if in the worst case we fail, at least maybe now we've formed new friendships, we gain skills. Scenario-based arguments take you at your worst or at a different spectrum of whatever type of motion you're dealing with. So this is specifically on general second speaker arguments. Now then we go into something interesting, making arguments on the spot. And here, usually this strategy I've used in opposition seconds. And here you can make the argument in the debate or anticipate multiple arguments in prep, where you, like, maybe you have 3 pieces of papers, right, that have 3 different arguments. Then just depending on what proposition runs, you have maybe that comparative argument. And these are usually comparative arguments, right, that can be made on the spot, or you have ready-made sets of arguments that you just pick to use. Especially in break rounds, this is important. Usually, as I've said, there's a meta change that says seconds probably wouldn't have a substantive. But the reason why the teams I've been on, I've argued that maybe P2 doesn't need an argument because like the P1 can just run through 3 arguments. But in O1, you have a lot of time constraints and you can't always run those 3 arguments. But also, you may already be losing on opposition. They may have already been a deadlock and you just need an added argument. So here in prep, this is especially where you think of the arguments on the spot. Obviously, in the debate, you can maybe turn your rebuttal into substantive, and that's a technique I've used. But in prep, I anticipate these arguments by asking 2 questions. Firstly, what deadlocks are likely to occur and how can I deal with them, or how can I resolve them? So maybe the first speech is both argue that we're both getting money or we both succeed. How can I resolve that deadlock? Second scenario, second question I ask myself is there another scenario, another aspect, or another time frame that the first speeches or the debate is missing, or even a different actor for that just under that logic, right? And I remember in a debate that I was in at a tournament, I think it was Doxbridge, I had a debate on religious revolution groups, and we both argued on whether or not they will be able to overthrow a government, and in their second, they argued yes, they would, but it will harm the country when they do. So they picked a different time frame, admitting that there is a deadlock, but why, on the comparative, they would be better. And that's how they broke that deadlock. So second speeches can really adapt, and that was their P2, I think, that adapted. So it's really, really important that you can also adapt in the debate, because preps don't only end after the 60th minute or the 30th minute. It's still happening as you're debating. That's why you communicate on the bench. So the next part of this video is how to apply pressure and place traps which will overwhelm the next speaker. It's a bit of dark debating, but applying pressure has a lot of legitimate forms too. The reason why second speakers should especially be doing this is because usually second speeches are very close to a lot of contentions, and for instance, if a P2 does a lot, it means the O2 will also have to deal with a lot, because they're not only responding to the P1, but a lot of new stuff and a lot of important stuff from P2. But secondarily, it means that you delay the next speaker from giving the most important attacks, but also it means that they have a lot to prioritize in their speech, which means they won't get through everything, which will allow your third speakers to further deepen the case or further weaponize it, meaning the O3, for example, would have a lot to do and also won't be able to attack everything very easily. Okay, there are roughly 8 ways to apply pressure and even place traps. The first way is that you critique the example usage that the other team is using. And here you can either show how this helps your side of the house in terms of the examples they're using, or how it's bad for their side. And when you're trying to show how it's bad for their side, a lot of really good teams add analogies to the examples they're using. So the same way you would add an analogy in your principal argument or your principal response, you would do it the same way. This is because they would need to break it down in terms of the analogy before responding to the actual stuff that you've put out, right? Meaning they have 2 things to do. And common examples of this is usually when another side is against maybe choice or against freedoms. A lot of really good teams could maybe tie to an analogy of democracy, for example. So on their side, they have to either show that maybe it's not linked to democracy, or that it's not or they just reject it as a whole, which would make their side look bad. Just a note on critiquing example usage. This is not a rebuttal, but rather is a comment, i.e., it's some sort of feedback when you're saying your speech. So when you are giving responses, you don't say, my first response is that the examples were wrong. Usually, speakers put it in their intro. A lot of good second speakers put it in their intro, or they just say it just before they give their responses. So like the first thing they talked about was X, Y, and Z, and this example was really bad that they used, but here are three responses. Obviously saying why it was a bad example. The reason why you use why you critique example usage is because it somewhat delays them. So a lot of speakers, when they just stop writing and they look at you like, no, that's wrong, or it makes them really think about the examples that they're using. Any form of delay is important, but also it makes them look bad, right? Like, obviously, examples may not always be inherent to the case, but if you can make them look bad in some way, it kind of persuades the edge, right? Like, since debating is like a game of persuasion, you should always try to persuade the edge. Cool. The second form, or the second way of applying pressure, is by burden pushing or job pushing, which a lot of speakers call it, where essentially you're making the next speaker have to clean up something or clarify something. And here a lot of speakers especially do this in strategic issues, where maybe they show the other side's case is not unique, the mechanisms were uncomparative, or even the counterfactual was wrong because maybe in prep you discussed the correct model or counterfactual that they had to defend. Obviously here you have to justify the burden push, right? So for instance, if maybe like in an emotion about like dark humor or dark humor, and they say no, we won't defend the worst forms, you burden push that they have to because maybe you characterize most dark humor as very offensive, for example. So obviously you still have to justify why you're pushing things, but it applies pressure for the next speaker to either reject it or work with it. The third tactic and the fourth one are traps, and here are somewhat of like the dark forms of debating, but they're very like motion dependent and context dependent. I wouldn't always apply these. So the third one is a trap called reloaded matter in O2. And essentially what's happening is that even it could work in P2, where the second speaker set a new direction in the debate. So if you're an op, you probably give your strongest responses, or you change the path to victory with new matter, new weighing. If you're on proposition, you show there's a different important actor in this debate after the first speaker's exchanges. Essentially what you're doing is that you're extending the debate, especially if you're on O2, in a new way. So if a lot of the important stuff come out in O2, it means P3 is the only one who can respond to it. And under WSDC rules, this is technically still allowed because P3 has a chance to respond to it. But again, it's also maybe not the most strategic thing to do. It's like in worst case scenarios. The fourth one is definitely dependent on some motions only, like in really tense motions, like maybe in the motion around like dark humor, for example, you may have to do this. But obviously you still have to be very clear from first, because clarity is what actually wins rounds, makes it much more persuasive, and allows you to build and evolve your case. But delayed strategy is where the first maybe in setup sets the trap and you enable the trap. So for instance, when you're burden pushing, or you show that you don't have to defend something, or there's a chat around lines in the sand, in your speech you clarify it. So for example, in a motion around maybe like dark humor, you say in first in P1 that we don't have to defend the worst forms of dark humor. And maybe you just said that, or you gave one reason, like, oh, it's constitutionally wrong, and O1 tries to reframe, and then you're like, oh no, our stance is that we don't have to because it's genuinely hate speech, and maybe that's bad form of comedy. So okay, maybe that wasn't the best example, but pretty much you clarify like those lines in the sand when you're delaying the strategy. The fifth way is when you bring back matter that hasn't been responded to. And here, the way you apply pressure when you do that is not just rehashing the material. You bridge the gaps that existed, or you add new reasons why it's true. Obviously, don't do this a lot because it is unstrategic. Like if something's already true or intuitive, don't waste time on that. In fact, you can weigh this even more. Okay, cool. Those were the first 5 ways. The next 3 ways, so the sixth one is strategic POIs. And here, a teammate of mine named Russell did this quite often. And pretty much what they would do is that during opposition first, for example, O1 would be giving a speech. And we would ask a POI, and depending on the response that we get from O1, and this would usually be set as questions, strategic questions. If O1 says yes, we would have a response to that. If O1 said no, we also had a response to that. And pretty much here, you're making them like fall into this trap because although it comes off as a normal POI or like a ridiculous POI, it is strategic because it helps your speech and makes them also have a contention around a POI. Obviously, your side wouldn't put that in a clash, but it means the next speaker from their side has to deal with it. The seventh way is double-layered responses. And here there are 2 scenarios which you can engage in. The first scenario is maybe their argument wasn't that good. What you can do is that you respond to what they said, and then you steel man, i.e. that you take the best version of their case, and here you can either fix the hole by maybe giving them the reasons of analysis or stronger mechanisms, or you just take them at their best. And essentially what you do in this like chain of thought, you respond to the original weaker version of the argument, but then you also respond to the stronger version of it. And here you can even show maybe that stronger version helps your side, or maybe the opposite claim is true. And here you literally are triple layering it. What this does is that as O2 is listening to your speech, in their mind, they're already trying to fix, maybe in their paper they're writing down, the analysis that was missing. But when you give them the analysis that was missing, and you also respond to that, the opposition second has to rewrite on their paper. You're essentially delaying them or making them need to think of new responses. And especially if they're speaking next, that's a problem. The second scenario of double layering responses is when their case is good, but you gave a strong response, you still have to preempt what they might respond to that and respond to that preemption of the response that would be said to you. And there's a concept called tiering analysis where you're kind of like essentially what you're doing is, as it's like, it is what it said, right? You're making the analysis stronger. You're making there be multiple levels to it. You can tier responses too. A good example of this is in motions maybe around medical trials. Maybe the opposition case would say that you're infringing on choice because people don't have enough information. But then you show that in your speech as a P2 that, look, maybe giving a medical trial like a blood test, for example, or like organ donation is something very big, so people research on it. But then maybe O2 might say, but look, they don't really maybe care about information at all because the money coerced them. Then you're like, but even in that regard, if they were coerced by not having enough information, it's not a bad thing because these medical trials are probably safe after all, because maybe the hospital or the corporation doesn't want to be sued or the government don't want to receive backlash. And what you do is that you're preempting the responses. Cool. The last thing that you can do is, especially at the end of your clashes, you weigh and be comparative. This is so that the next speaker isn't only responding to what you said, they still have to deal with your weighing by either giving their own weigh-ups or refuting the weighing that you've done. So these are the 8 ways you can apply pressure and place traps. Now moving on to how to adapt as a second, there are 4 things to note. The first is prevent a situation where you would want to have to adapt in the first place. And here literally, you do this in prep where you try fixing the holes. Especially in arguments, and what I usually do is when I'm building arguments, let's say this 5-minute argument silent prep or 10-minute argument silent prep, I allocate a bit of time to trying to attack my own arguments as if I were the other team. This allows me to preempt responses to those responses, or add new links or mechanisms to my argument, making it stronger. The second way, which is in the debate, is when ops case is not what I expected, I firstly read the room. Remember, ages are human. The feeling, the vibrancy in the room, the energy when ages are nodding, when the people who are watching are nodding after they re-clarified the strategy in the round. You should take note of those things. Generally speaking, when you're reading the room and you're noticing maybe in fact they were right, the O1's giving the best argument ever. There are a lot of strategic questions or strategic decisions that you would have to make on the spot. And I think for the purposes of this video, being comfortable with knowing the decisions that you probably would have to make is probably, I think, a good idea. So generally it may be dropping the argument you've made or reshifting your focus on maybe in prep, you thought there would be a huge clash under your principal argument. You should focus on it. But now maybe you're reshifting your focus on what they said and most of your rebuttal will be around there. A helpful thing though, it is really hard to adapt in debates. And what I usually suggest with most of the teams I work with is during the anticipation portion of prep, or a lot of teams call it op lines, we make responses, or we anticipate general possible arguments, intuitive arguments they may say, but also on the lines they may say. So for instance, a lot of mistakes a lot of teams make actually is that they think of these really cool arguments and how they'd respond to it, but a lot of the times those arguments don't come up. But in a debate about counterfactuals or a debate, let's say, about policy, it is sometimes intuitive of what the possible alternatives are and how you'd respond to those. For instance, in a motion about pharmaceutical companies, if you believe that on your side you should be nationalizing it, opposition could argue that no, we shouldn't nationalize them at all, or we regulate the current privatized ones. Those are general lines an opposition case could run, and if you have general responses to those, it makes anticipating the case or like adapting easier because you are aware of these things from the get-go. Or another way is just maybe your path to victory changes. If they were really, really good at it, literally you just accept and have to attack it. But sometimes the case is maybe not what you expected and not the right one, you still reframe. A common mistake people make when reframing is they assert another iteration of the framing. What you should usually do, like let's say there's a characterization issue, you point out the characterization issue, then you show what it is, why it's wrong, and then you eventually substitute what is the right characterization for maybe the debate. Cool. The third way of adapting is very, very underrated. And essentially here, what you do is you stylistically adapt. And here you read the room. Maybe there aren't enough illustrations. Maybe there aren't enough examples. Maybe the room is very quiet. It's an economics motion. Everything's very boring. You should try and adapt because style is still something adjudicated upon. You should adapt so your speech can be groundbreaking, so you can refocus the edges. Like when they stop focusing, you just like make them refocus. And usually just plays in part of just sounding different in the room. So trying to stylistically adapt is something that you should be trying to do. Ultimately, be comfortable with the shift. And here, sometimes when you're shifting, or maybe the case, like I said in the second point, is not what you expected. Usually people, or at least like struggle to adapt to that shift because they're like, how would I fit it in this clash? Is this even a clash anymore? Is this a path to victory anymore? And my advice to that is just create direct clashes between those two ideas, then wait. Oftentimes, or at least in the current meta, most people just treat clashes as just another way of structuring the speech. But literally, clashes when you first learn debating is X versus Y. And if you can create a direct clash between those two ideas when you're shifting maybe in your speech, it makes it much easier to weigh those up. Now, this portion is how to structure a second. The macro structure is that you just have an intro and then you can go through strategic issues, then clashes, then your argument. But I found out that that's like a lot, especially like this transition from strategy to a clash that may not even be in the debate, especially if you're in P2, then an argument. So I would say integrate everything, so you still keep your intro, then your clashes, and you can consider like the contextual issues even as a clash, for instance, and then go on to your argument. But I still would go with the first iteration that I said: intro, strat issues, clashes, and then an argument. Usually, sometimes, like I said, they may not be clear clashes, but you can create direct clashes between two ideas, then weigh them. However, sometimes you can just use questions, which are very effective, right? So for instance, if you had a non-clash argument from your first, and then a non-clash argument from the O1, then you can create a question dealing with their matter and then a question dealing with your matter. This is just so it's easier to adjudicate, because after all, debates are won on clashes, questions, etc. But this specific portion of how to structure a second was I just wanted to do a bit of work on comparatives and weighing in second. Just note that there are general tools of weighing that any workshop may have, any video online may have, but each speech should be trying to use specific ones. So for instance, as a first, you may have anticipated the wrong case and wasted your time doing clear-cut weigh-ups. As a third, you've already seen what has happened, so your weigh-ups are probably a bit more intuitive. Like the comparatives in the first are probably just why this is exclusive to our side, as opposed to maybe why we're better on the comparative all the time, because you may not be anticipating the right case. But as a second, your type of weighing, again, should be somewhat, again, using the general tools, but a bit more specific, because you have seen the early iteration of the debate, but not the entirety of the case, because they still have next speakers who could evolve the case. So I would note three things. The first thing is, when you are explaining maybe the comparative as a P2, for example, you take the other side at their best. So again, this is similar to the applying pressure thing that I talked about earlier on. So as an O2 is writing, you probably to fix the hole that like you just responded to, you would note that they just wasted their time because you already took them at their best. So for instance, again, like if, for example, you just showed like, look, in a success and failure motion, opposition lead to burnout. And then now O2 is quickly writing responses on how they don't lead to burnout or deal with your response. It's just like, look, if we take them at their best, that like people reach burnout, don't reach burnout, like they still fail for XY reasons. The second thing, though, is why your benefit is much more important, even after what O1 said, right? Because here you can dictate where the round goes with what weighing metrics you're doing and what you're weighing. And in prep, you probably had a discussion on how you want to win the debate, i.e. the path to victory. And here you can clearly, cherry pick the things that you're weighing and the types of metrics that you're using in your speech, which can dictate the rest of the round and how it's decided. Ultimately, O1s, especially really good O1s, give weighing. And I think it's not just enough to refute the logic or just to try and outweigh the other side, but also try to refute the logic, the weighing, the impacting O1 has already said. This can allow you to dictate where the weighing goes in the round because you're dealing with the metric set up in O1. Okay, cool. Now, the last part of this video is just miscellaneous things. There were 4 that I thought of. Number 1, learn to be conversational in debates and provide commentary. And this is something that happens a lot in BP. When you're providing commentary, especially at the end of your clashes, a lot of seconds do this maybe after every point. That's kind of excessive in my opinion. Maybe at the end of a clash, maybe at the end of certain responses. Show the edges. What has already happened? and explain why you're saying what you're saying, i.e. what you've already said, and impact that response, winning that clash, and how it interacts with other arguments, other framing, the strategy in the round. So for instance, you may have responded to their biggest claim. Be conversational and tell the edge, like, look, I literally just like took down their biggest premise. This harms the strategy in XYZ ways. This is important. And again, I would suggest doing this because in P2 you have a lot to do. You may not write everything down. So if you learn to be conversational, you can even do the impacting of winning a clash, a response, while you're speaking, and you're just letting the edge know. Because after all, you are writing down the ballot for the edge, and that's where the best speakers come out. The second thing that I would give for advice is when you're note taking, try focusing on bullet points and mini cues, because again, if you're in P2, you probably don't have a lot of time, because maybe the first 4 minutes of O1 is just responses and reframing. Then you only have another 4 minutes to respond to their two arguments that were very well thought of in prep. Thirdly, and this is important, flag your extensions. Again, especially in the local circuit in South Africa, if you're doing the like a third scenario, or even in the international circuit, don't try to sound very responsive and rely on rebuttal. Sometimes your rebuttal does have new matter, and because you are a second, flag that this is an extension. If you're showing a different impact, different actor being impacted by a response, or when you're adding analysis to what your first has said, flag it as an extension. But moreover, turn your response in substantive if you're not flagging it as an extension. Sometimes you may have really, really good responses, but would come off much, much better when you make it as an argument. Like I said, you can still make arguments on the in the round. Cool. Lastly, effectively reframe, and I hashed over this earlier on. Like, when you're reframing the debate, always justify why your one is better. Like, definitional challenges are very, very messy. It's really hard to decide which definition was more intuitive in very close rounds. The more you show that you're plausible, the more reasons you give as to why your characterization is likely, why theirs isn't, the more real-life examples of your definition playing out. When you effectively reframe, when you follow those steps that I mentioned earlier on the video, probably good. Thank you for coming through to the video. I hope this was really, really helpful.